name's Brooke, Uteh. The reason I got into reading is because whenever I started at a very young age with my dad reading to me and both my brothers, the reason A Wrinkle in Time kind of touches with me, I read the entire series, but it kind of touches home for me because I wasn't necessarily as smart as my older brother, and so I kind of struggled with that, but that helped me to learn that I was smart in other ways and I had other niches to life. And I didn't necessarily fit in school either. All right. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg? I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be, can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she roughhoused with a little to make herself feel better, and one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home, walking up the road with her arm full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Dennis, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. "A delinquent, that's what I am," she thought grimly. "That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them, everyone else. I wish father," but it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. "Why can't I hide it too?" Meg thought. "Why do I always have to show everything?" The window rattled madly in the wind. She pulled the quilt close about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg, even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio, there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in that rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky, to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. "You asked to have the attic bedroom," she told herself savagely. "Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment." "Not during a hurricane it isn't a privilege," she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge innocent eyes. "Go back to sleep," Meg said. "Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me." She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouth full of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed up her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, let out a sigh as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame in spite of the protection of the storm sash that was supposed to be offered. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way down the stairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was. This time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll houses. Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother, sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing against her glasses as though they could help her see better in the dark. Dennis was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. They weren't great students either, but they weren't bad ones. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners, good at games, and when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy or Dennis. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time. Then, Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear. If we screamed and screamed and screamed, nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. It'll cheer me up, and if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there in the big, old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you." From under the table, where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Llewellyn setter and part greyhound, and he had slender dark beauty that was all his own. "Why don't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. "I've been scared stiff." "Too windy up in that attic of yours," the little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew or seemed to care what Dennis or Sandy were thinking. It was his mother's mind and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite right? "I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children," Meg had once overheard. The two boys seemed to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there. It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he never learned to talk, and it was true that he hadn't talked until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and on his own time." "I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me," Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen to be the usual pace." How do you know? Meg had demanded. How do you know that I'm not dumb? Is it just because you love me? I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I given you a number of tests, you know. That was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents had played with her were tests of some kind, and that they were more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins. IQ tests, she said? Yes, some of them. Is my IQ okay? More than okay. What is it? That I'm not going to tell you, but it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to be yourselves. You'll just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see. How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak, suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences, how proud he would have been. "You'd better check milk," Charles Wallace said to Meg now. His diction clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. "You know you don't like it when it gets the skin on top." "You put more than twice enough milk," Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace. Do I need to stop?
In 1 minute.
Okay. I thought Mother might like some. I might like what? A voice at the door said. "Cocoa," Charles Wallace said. "Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one." "That would be lovely," Mrs. Murray said. "But I can make it myself if you're busy." "No trouble at all." Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator. "How about you, Meg? Sandwich?" "Yes, please, but not liverwurst. Do you have any tomatoes?" Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. "One. All right. Is it all right if I use it on Meg, Mother?" "To what better use could it be put?" Mrs. Murray smiled. "But not so loud, please, Charles. That is unless you want the twins downstairs." "Let's be exclusive," Charles Wallace said. "That's my word for the day. Impressive, isn't it?"
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you have a t-shirt on your